The briefing room smelled like old coffee and male ego. I know that sounds like a strange thing to notice when you're about to walk into the most important mission briefing of your career, but that's what I noticed. Old coffee and ego. The kind that hangs in the air like cigarette smoke even years after smoking's been banned. My name is Captain Rena Vasquez, call sign Spectre. I was 29 years old, the only woman in a room of 11, and I had not slept in 31 hours. My boots were still damp from the morning run through the coastline mud. We were stationed at NAS Meridian Gulf, a forward operating base that sat half on sand and half on the edge of the world, and the back of my neck had that specific kind of sweat sting that comes from humidity and helmet straps in the same 12-hour rotation. I took my seat at the far left end of the table. Nobody moved their chair to make room. Nobody needed to. There was plenty of room. I just want you to understand the geometry of that moment. 11 men spread across a table built for 20, and I sat at the edge, where the light from the overhead projector didn't quite reach. Admiral Creed Halston entered at 0630 precisely. He was one of those men who entered a room like a weather system. 61 years old, hair the color of an aircraft carrier deck, that particular gray that's more steel than anything else, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved with a chisel and then left outside in the sun for a decade. He'd flown combat missions in 3 different conflicts across 38 years of service. He didn't walk exactly. He arrived. He dropped a manila folder on the table, didn't sit, and looked across the room in that way senior officers do. Not seeing you individually, seeing the collective resource of you. "We have a problem," he said. "Chatter from the Straits, picked up 6 hours ago. The Corinthia, Meridian Gulf's only fast attack surveillance platform, has gone dark. Navigation blackout, communication failure, and she's drifting into contested airspace over the Iraq corridor." He clicked the projector. The map appeared. Red zone. A very specific, very unfriendly red zone. The Iraq corridor was a maritime choke point about 40 miles wide, contested by 2 nations that didn't officially exist in any public policy document, defended by a surface-to-air missile system that had downed 3 aircraft in the previous 14 months, 2 of them ours, and monitored by a drone network that we'd been trying to neutralize for the better part of 2 years. Getting the Corinthia back out meant flying in. Flying low, flying fast, and flying in something that didn't advertise itself on every radar screen in a 400-mile radius. "We'll be sending 2 aircraft," Halston continued. "A standard escort and intercept configuration. F-18s on escort. We need a 3rd aircraft for recon, low signature, high maneuverability, and we need it now." He looked at the table. Then Lieutenant Commander Dax Rourke of the perfectly pressed flight suit, Rourke, who had the sort of confidence that gets handed to you along with a silver spoon, said it. Casually. The way men say things they think are funny because they've only ever said them to other men who agreed. Spectre could always take the F-12. He wasn't looking at me when he said it. He was looking at Halston. He smiled at the corner of his mouth. That smile that isn't really a smile. It's punctuation. The F-12. Our base's F-12 prototype. Officially the YF-12C Advanced Tactical Reconnaissance Variant. Had been sitting in Hangar 7 for 11 months. It was a temperamental, beautiful, barely certified aircraft that 3 different test pilots had deemed not operationally ready. It had lateral thrust issues that made it twitch at low altitude, an experimental targeting system that ran off software nobody fully understood, and an ejection seat that had, on its 3rd test, fired spontaneously during ground taxi. Nobody flew the F-12. It was a joke. That's why Rourke said it. Spectre could always take the F-12, the implication being that sending a woman into the Iraq corridor was about as plausible as sending the broken, not quite real aircraft that lived in a dark hangar like a rumor. 2 men at the table laughed. Not big laughs. Pocket laughs. The kind that only need 1 second. Halston didn't laugh. But he did not laugh either. He moved on. He kept talking about the F-18 escort configuration. Satellite window. Extraction protocol. He was professional about it, in the way that professionals can be when they don't want to see something clearly. I wrote nothing on my notepad during the remainder of that briefing. I was running numbers in my head. The Iraq corridor, at its narrowest point, was 38 miles. The SAM batteries, 3 of them, triangulated, created a coverage pattern that made the standard flight envelope useless. The F-18s would have to fly high and fast, which meant they'd light up every radar in range. What you'd actually need, what the corridor's specific geography demanded, was something that could fly at 150 feet above sea level, something with a radar cross-section the size of dinner plate, something that could hit Mach 2.4 and still make the kind of micro-adjustments that low corridor flying required. You need something like the F-12. Broken, unreliable, barely certified, ejection seat with opinions F-12. I looked up from my notepad. The briefing was wrapping. Halston was answering a question from Major Torres about fuel margins. I raised my hand. Not high, not dramatically. Just enough. Sir. Halston looked at me. So did everyone else. I'll fly the F-12. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room being impressed. It was the silence of a room being uncomfortable. That particular brand of quiet that happens when someone says something that the room collectively wishes they hadn't, because now everyone has to figure out what face to make. Rourke looked at his coffee. Torres looked at the projector. Petty Officer Kaminsky, who was only there to run the slides, studied the floor with the devotion of a man who had found God in the linoleum. Halston looked at me for 3 full seconds. Captain Vasquez, he said, and his voice was so carefully neutral it was its own kind of answer. The F-12 is not certified for operational flight. I know, sir. It's been flagged by 3 separate test pilots. I've read all 3 reports. That surprised him. His eyes moved, almost nothing, a flicker, but I'd spent enough time reading senior officers to catch it. It has lateral instability below 300 feet at speeds above Mach 1.1, I said. Below Mach 0.9, the lateral drift is negligible. The corridor requires low-end, slow entry before the high-speed push. The instability window doesn't overlap the mission profile if you sequence it right. Another silence. Different texture than the first one. Rourke made a sound. Not quite a scoff. The cousin of a scoff. You've flown the F-12, he asked. No, you've simmed it. 41 hours in the advanced sim. Plus the technical manual twice. The software architecture is based on the F-22 variant I flew for 18 months out of Eglin. Rourke opened his mouth. Closed it. Halston turned away from me and looked at the map on the projector. The Iraq corridor sat there in its red certainty, indifferent to every opinion in the room. Dismissed, he said. All of you except Vasquez and Rourke. The room emptied. Kaminsky practically ran. Halston sat down for the first time since he'd entered. He was quiet for a moment. Not thinking, I realized. He was deciding whether to think. Those are different things. What makes you believe you can manage the ejection anomaly? He asked. I don't believe I can manage it, sir. I believe the anomaly was caused by a wiring fault in the seat sensor that's been corrected in the latest maintenance cycle. Chief Okonkwo signed off on it 10 days ago. The seat hasn't been tested post-correction, but the fault was discrete and the fix was clean. You've spoken to Okonkwo. Last night, sir. 2200. Rourke leaned forward. To his credit, the scoffing had left his face. What replaced it was something more complicated. Not respect, exactly, but the precursor to it. That particular expression, men, where when their joke walked into something real, and they're not sure what to do with their hands anymore. The satellite window for the corridor is 94 minutes from now, I said. If we're using the F-18 escort configuration without the F-12, you've got a radar exposure problem between waypoints 4 and 6 that the current mission profile doesn't account for. The Corinthia will still be in contested range when the window closes. Halston was quiet. The projector hummed. Outside, a transport helicopter cut across the sky, its rotors pulsing through the briefing room wall. If I say no, Halston said, and the Corinthia doesn't make it out, then you made the right call with the information and the authorization level you were comfortable with, I said. I won't hold it against the mission or the outcome. That surprised him more than anything else I'd said. I could see it. Not the answer he expected from someone making their case. Most people arguing for something argue against the alternative. I was doing something different. I was giving him his exit with dignity intact, and he recognized it, and it told him something about me. He looked at Rourke. Rourke gave a single small shrug. The shrug of a man who had started a joke, and watched it become a decision that was above his pay grade. Halston looked back at me. "Suit up," he said. "You've got 11 minutes. I stood, nodded. "Vasquez." I stopped at the door. "If the seat fires on the runway," he said, and his voice was very quiet, "I'm going to be very annoyed." It was the only version of good luck he was capable of giving. I took it. Chief Petty Officer Emmanuel Okonkwo was already in the hangar when I got there. This is the thing about truly good maintenance chiefs. They know before you know. Okonkwo had been working aircraft for 22 years, and somewhere in those 22 years he had developed a sixth sense about when a plane was going to be needed. He told me once that the aircraft changed their breathing when a mission was coming, which was either profound or insane, and I decided I didn't need to know which. He handed me my helmet without a word. The F-12 sat in the center of the hangar under 2 work lights, and I want to tell you that it looked like something heroic, something cinematic and silver and arrow sharp. It did look like that, but it also looked like a thing that had been argued about, like a thing that had been the subject of too many committees. It had that slightly self-conscious quality of objects that know they're in dispute. "Seat sensors clean," Okonkwo said, already walking toward the wheel checks. "I put in the corrected harness assembly yesterday morning. Tested the sensor circuit 3 times. It's not going to fire on you." "I know," I said. "You don't know. You believe." Different thing. He was right. I didn't argue. I walked the aircraft. The walk around that every pilot does before every flight. You could do it in your sleep. You could do it after 31 hours of no sleep, which is what I was doing. And it's half technical and half something else, something closer to introduction. You put your hands on the surfaces. You check the seams. You look at the intake geometry. At a certain point, you're not just inspecting, you're asking. The F-12 was cold to the touch. The hangar kept its temperature low for avionics, and the aircraft skin had that chill that aluminum gets when it's been sitting. Not a dead cold, not the cold of something inert. More like the cold of something patient. I pressed my palm flat against the fuselage just after the cockpit. "Okay," I said. "To nobody." "To it." Okonkwo appeared at my shoulder. "Fuel is full margin. Armament is loaded. 2 air-to-ground harms for the SAM suppression window, and the standard reconnaissance package. Targeting software is running on the updated build. Still has the parsing lag on terrain match, about 1/3 of a second, which at altitude means nothing, but at low, I know about the lag," I said. "At low altitude, it means you'll have to anticipate," he said, ignoring me with the practiced grace of a man who had been ignoring pilots for 22 years. "You'll be reading the terrain a beat ahead of what the system shows you. It'll feel like flying drunk. Have you ever flown drunk?" "Twice. I don't recommend it." He helped me into the cockpit. It was tighter than the F-18, not claustrophobic tight, but specific tight, the way a well-made glove is tight. The seat geometry put you forward slightly, so your field of view through the canopy was wider than you expected, almost like the aircraft was offering you something, pushing you toward the world instead of sitting you back from it. I ran the startup sequence. The F-12 started differently than other aircraft. Most jets have a sound that's familiar, a building whine that escalates into the foundational roar you know in your chest. The F-12 had a lower register to its ignition, a kind of bass note shudder that moved through the seat and into your spine, less like a mechanical event and more like a very large living thing deciding to wake up. I checked the lateral stabilizer response. Clean. I ran the targeting software through its handshake. Acceptable. I looked at the ejection seat indicator. Green. Okonkwo had done his job, which meant Okonkwo had done miracles, which was what Okonkwo always did. The radio crackled. "Spectre, this is Tower. You're cleared to taxi. Rourke and Torres are on the runway. They're waiting on you. I keep my mic copy, Tower. Spectre rolling in 60 seconds. I looked through the canopy at the hangar ceiling. The work lights. The industrial normalness of a space where extraordinary things lived in ordinary conditions. Okonkwo was standing at the edge of the light, helmet off, arms crossed. He watched a lot of aircraft leave this hangar. I couldn't tell from his face whether he thought this was different or whether after 22 years, they all looked the same. I keyed the intercom. He wasn't plugged in, but I set it anyway into the aircraft's interior air as if it would find him. She's going to fly clean, Chief. I taxied out. The runway at NAS Meridian Gulf runs directly toward the sea. I want you to understand that. When you push the throttle and begin the takeoff roll, you're aimed literally and completely at open water. There's no reassuring land mass waiting at the end of the runway. No far ridge, no cityscape. There's a strip of concrete, the ocean, and the sky. The runway is a statement about intent. I pushed a full military thrust. The F-12, and this is the only word, surged. Not the clean, linear acceleration of the F-18. A surge, a willfulness, like it had been waiting in that hangar too long and was now making a point about being caged. The runway markings blurred. The airspeed tape climbed. I rotated at 220 knots. The nose came up, and the sea dropped away, and we were airborne, the Gulf of Meridian opening beneath me in the last gray light before full sunrise, the water that particular shade of early morning. Not blue, not black, the color of a bruise healing. Spectre airborne, I said. Spectre is clean. Copy, Spectre, said Rourke's voice. Good to hear it. Form up on my 3. We'll hit waypoint 1 in 8 minutes. I found his F-18 and Torres's F-18, two blunt, powerful shapes against the sky, and slid into the echelon position. From outside, the 3 of us would have looked like a standard formation. Nothing unusual. 2 escort fighters and their charge. Except their charge was flying an aircraft that wasn't supposed to be flying, on a mission that had been proposed as a joke, piloted by the only woman in the briefing room who'd been sitting in the part where the projector light didn't reach. Nice aircraft, said Torres over comms. He meant it. You could hear it. She is, I said. We flew east. The first 15 minutes were clean. Altitude, 22,000 feet. Speed, Mach 0.95. The Herat corridor sat 40 miles ahead, its borders marked on my HUD in the amber orange of advisory airspace, the color that means here be problems. Weather was clear. Wind was 4 knots out of the northwest. The sea below us was an unbroken plate. I ran through my corridor entry sequence in my head. The approach called for a descent to low altitude approximately 12 miles before the corridor boundary. Below radar coverage from the primary sand battery meant staying under 150 feet above sea level for most of the corridor transit. 150 feet above moving water in an aircraft with a documented stability issue, flying toward a target with 3 independent missile systems. This was not a normal mission profile. Vasquez, said Rourke. Corridor entry in 6 minutes. You'll diverge at waypoint 2. We'll be at altitude covering your exit window. Copy. If the SAMs activate, I know what to do, Rourke. I'm aware. I'm just saying it anyway. There was a pause. Then Vasquez. I was out of line this morning. I looked out at his F-18, 400 meters to my right, a solid shape against the sky. Focus on the mission, Commander, I said. Another pause. Yeah, okay. That was enough. Some things don't need to be all the way resolved to be done. Waypoint 2 came up on my HUD. I broke right, descended, and went to work. 140 feet above the water, at Mach 0.85, the world doesn't look the way you'd expect. You'd think it would feel fast. It doesn't. It feels close. The sea is not a surface below you. It is a wall beside you, rushing along your peripheral vision, close enough that if you thought too clearly about what it would feel like to meet it, you'd stop thinking clearly about everything else. I stopped thinking about what it would feel like to meet it. The F-12 was twitching. Not badly. Not dangerously. Not yet. That lateral instability the test pilots had logged was there, a low-frequency shiver in the airframe, like the aircraft was correcting itself constantly against something I couldn't feel. My hands on the stick were light. You don't muscle a twitchy aircraft. You listen to it. You become the dampener instead of the driver. My target was the Corinthia. She was a signals intelligence vessel, gray, unremarkable, the kind of ship that looks like it has nothing interesting aboard and is therefore the most interesting ship in any harbor. 53 personnel. She'd gone dark, navigation offline, comm scrambled, and she was drifting northeast at approximately 4 knots, being carried by the current directly toward the eastern covered zone of SAM Battery Kilo 3. My job was simple in the way that impossible things are always simple when you describe them briefly. Reach the Corinthia, transmit a hardline navigation correction on the secure burst frequency, confirm receipt, and get out before the SAM network completed its tracking cycle. 53 people on a drifting ship. Dark, not knowing whether anyone was coming. I flew lower. 120 feet. The corridor had a specific smell. I know that sounds wrong. You're inside a pressurized cockpit, sealed against the outside world, but at very low altitude over open water in early morning, the cockpit air has a quality, a heaviness, like the sea is breathing back at you. I was 8 miles into the corridor when the radar warning receiver lit up. Single tone. Acquisition radar. One of the SAM batteries had found me. Not locked, not firing, but looking. The difference between an acquisition ping and a lock-on is approximately 3 seconds if the system is manned by someone competent. The F-12's radar cross-section is a dinner plate, like I said. But a dinner plate is still visible on a good enough system. And these were good enough systems. I dove to 80 feet. At 80 feet above the Harak corridor's water surface, with a mild 3-foot swell below me and the SAM acquisition tones still cycling in my ears, I made the decision that none of the test pilots had ever made. I took the F-12 to Mach 1.2. The instability issue. Below, 300 feet above Mach 1.1. Here is the thing I had not told Admiral Halston, because he hadn't asked, and because I had not been sure enough to say it. I believe the instability was correctable in flight. Not by the aircraft system, by the pilot. By the specific kind of input management that you develop only from flying inherently unstable aircraft, which I had done in a program that wasn't in any file Halston would have access to, in a posting that lasted 7 months, and that I had specifically not talked about in the briefing room, because 7 months of experimental aircraft handling is not the kind of credential that sounds like a credential. It sounds like a liability. The F-12 shook. Hard. Not a shiver. A shudder, a full-body lateral oscillation that lasted about 2 seconds, and tried to walk the nose 20 degrees left. My left hand on the throttle went to idle for half a second. My right hand fed in right rudder. I let the nose go. I did not fight it. I redirected it. The way you handle a horse that's decided to spook, not pulling against the panic, but angling it, giving it somewhere to go that isn't the ground. 1 breath. 2. The oscillation damped. The F-12 steadied at Mach 1.22, 82 feet above the Harak corridor's water, and the acquisition tone cycled twice and then went quiet. I had gone fast enough and low enough that I had passed through the seam between 2 SAM battery-covered zones. The gap was 11 seconds wide at this speed. I had planned for it. I had not been 100% certain it would work. It worked. The Corinthia appeared on my forward sensors at 9 miles. She was drifting exactly as the briefing had said, running lights on, which told me the crew was alive and functioning. No lights would have meant something much worse. She sat low in the water, unglamorous, looking on my HUD like a gray smudge against a gray sea. I was going to have approximately 90 seconds in her proximity before I needed to begin my exit run or lose the SAM window. 90 seconds. I switched to the burst transmission frequency. Corinthia actual, this is Spectre. Do you copy? Static. 1 second. 2. Spectre, we copy. The voice was hoarse. A woman's voice. I realized the Corinthia's comms officer. We copy. We've been dark for 4 hours. We didn't know, I know. Listen carefully. I'm transmitting a navigation packet on the burst channel now. Your helm needs to receive it and execute it within the next 40 seconds. The packet will give you a new heading and autocorrect your GPS. Do you have helm control? Helm is manual. We have manual. Execute the packet heading the moment you receive it. You're going to push southwest at your best speed. You'll exit contested range in about 90 minutes. Copy, Spectre. Are you? I was already transmitting. The navigation packet took 6 seconds to send. I watched the confirmation signal. Watched it. Come on, Green. Corinthia, confirm receipt. Confirm receipt. We have the heading. Spectre, are you? Her voice caught slightly. Are you one aircraft? Affirmative. A pause. The sound of a ship's bridge in controlled emergency. Commands being issued quietly in the background. "Thank you," she said. Just that. 2 words, in a voice that had been sitting in the dark for 4 hours wondering. "Get your heading, Corinthia," I said. "Get your people home." I broke left. Climbed. Went to full military thrust. The exit run through the Herat corridor is the part of this story that I won't fully describe. Not because it wasn't real. It was entirely real, but because certain things about flying at very low altitude at very high speed in a twitchy aircraft through a contested air defense zone are harder to explain than they are to survive. I will tell you the F-12 found its instability again at waypoint 6, mid-exit run, when I hit a thermal off the water surface and the airframe went lateral for 4 seconds. For seconds at a long time at 80 feet and Mach 1.3. I will tell you that at some point during those 4 seconds I thought, very clearly and without panic, of aJoke standing at the edge of the hangar light with his arms crossed. I will tell you that the ejection seat did not fire. I will tell you that the F-12 steadied. And I will tell you that when I climbed out of the corridor and the radar warning receiver went quiet and the sea opened back into unrestricted airspace, and Rourke's voice came over the radio saying, "Spectre, I have you visual, you are clear," I let out a breath that I had been holding for approximately 12 minutes. "Copy that, Rourke," I said. "I'm clean. Jesus Vasquez." "Language, Commander." A beat. His laugh came through the radio like something that had been waiting to happen. I landed back at NAS Meridian Gulf 41 minutes after the Corinthia confirmed receipt of the navigation packet. aJoke was on the runway. He was standing at the edge of the yellow taxi line with his arms still crossed, exactly as he'd been in the hangar, as if he hadn't moved, as if he'd simply been picked up and placed here. When I brought the F-12 to a stop and the canopy popped and the morning air hit me, Gulf humidity, jet fuel, salt, he walked to the aircraft with the unhurried pace of a man who had decided not to run because running would have admitted he'd been worried. He looked at the aircraft first, checked the exterior without speaking, put his hand on the fuselage the same way I had in the hangar, palm flat. Then he looked up at me. "Seat didn't fire," he said. "Seat didn't fire." He nodded once. The nod of a man whose work had been confirmed. "Lateral oscillation?" he asked. "Twice. Both times manageable." Define manageable. "I'm here." He looked at me for a moment with his mechanic's eyes, the eyes that read condition and stress and were the same way other people read faces. "You look tired," he said. "I've been awake 33 hours. That explains it." He reached up and offered me a hand climbing down from the cockpit. I took it. My legs were slightly wrong when I hit the ground. Not weak, just recalibrated, that particular remapping that happens after a body has been under sustained tension for an extended period and is now being asked to stand still on ordinary Earth. "Chief," I said. "Captain, good work on the seat." He shrugged, the way a man shrugs when he knows it's true, but has the dignity not to perform being pleased about it. "Good work on the flying." He paused, which you'll hear more about in about 10 minutes when you get inside. "HQ's been monitoring on satellite since your corridor entry. Base commander wants to see you. And Halston's there." I straightened my flight suit. "How'd he seem?" I asked. aJoke thought about this for exactly 1 second. "Quiet," he said. The base commander's office at NAS Meridian Gulf had a window that faced the runway, which I've always thought was either very thoughtful architecture or a very specific kind of torment, depending on the day. Captain Mercer, base commander, a compact man with a salt and pepper beard and the permanent slight squint of someone who has spent too many years in bright operational environments, was standing when I entered. Rourke and Torres were already there. Rourke was standing differently than he'd been standing in the briefing room that morning. Something in his posture had shifted. Not broken, not humble in any showy way. Just different, like a door that had been rehung slightly. Admiral Halston was at the window. He had his hands behind his back. He was looking at the runway, at the F-12, I realized, which was being towed back toward Hangar 7. He didn't turn when I entered. Mercer spoke. He spoke about the mission, the Corinthia status. She was pushing southwest on the corrected heading, expected to clear contested range in 80 minutes. All 53 crew confirmed safe. He spoke about the corridor transit, which the satellite had tracked, which had shown something that the imaging team was apparently still discussing, specifically the portion of the transit where the F-12 had descended to 80 feet and accelerated to Mach 1.2 through the gap between SAM-covered zones. That maneuver, Mercer said, looking at his notes, was not in the mission profile. No, sir, I said. It was improvised. It was planned, sir. Not in the briefing document, but planned. He looked up from the notes. There's a distinction there you're making. Yes, sir. I planned it before the briefing, based on the corridor geometry and the SAM battery placement data in the intelligence package. And you didn't include in the mission profile because it depended on the F-12 specific capabilities, which I hadn't confirmed in an operational context. And I wasn't prepared to argue for a mission profile element that rested on an aircraft nobody believed was operationally ready. Mercer was quiet. Rourke shifted his weight, not uncomfortably, the shift of a man recalibrating. At the window, Halston had not moved. Captain Vasquez, Mercer said, I'm going to ask you something, and I want a direct answer. Sir, when Rourke suggested the F-12, was that what prompted you to volunteer? I thought about that. Honestly, no, sir. I've been running the corridor geometry since the briefing started. The F-12 was the only aircraft with the right profile for the job. Rourke naming it I paused. It just made it easier to say. Mercer looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Somewhere between professional assessment and something warmer that he was keeping professional. Dismissed Torres Rourke, he said. They left. The door closed. Halston turned from the window. He looked at me for a long moment. Not the evaluating look of the briefing room, not the careful neutrality of a senior officer managing a room. This was the look of a man who had watched something happen and was still deciding what it meant to him. The corridor gap, he said. The 11-second window at Mach 1.2 at 80 feet. You planned that before you walked into my briefing. Yes, sir. You had the intelligence package in advance. Yes, sir. I requested it at 2,100 last night. Same time I called Okonkwo about the seat. A muscle in his jaw moved. Not anger. Something more internal. You came into that briefing knowing what the mission required, he said. And you sat at the end of the table and waited to see if anyone else would see it. I didn't answer that, because it wasn't a question, not quite. Why didn't you lead with it? He asked. You could have walked in there and put the full picture on the table before I finished my first sentence. I looked at him directly. Because a room that's been surprised by the problem doesn't hear solutions well, sir. I needed them to feel the problem first. He was quiet. The runway was visible through the window behind him. The F-12 was almost back to Hangar 7, small in the distance. A shape that looked, from here, like any other aircraft. The 3 test pilots who red-flagged the F-12, Halston said. None of them had a background on unstable airframes. No, sir. That background, the posting that's not in your primary file. Yes, sir. Why isn't it in your primary file? I chose my words carefully. Because the program it's associated with is still classified, and because when it ended, the officer who was supposed to transfer the notation to my permanent record didn't. Halston looked at me. Didn't. Or decided not to. I said nothing. He understood what that nothing meant. He walked past me to his desk, sat down, opened a folder that had been waiting there, and I realized with a specific quality of stillness that the folder had my name on it, that it had been sitting there before this conversation started. He picked up a pen. He looked at the paper in front of him. He looked at me. There are things that should have been different, he said, in that briefing, across the past year, possibly longer. He wasn't apologizing exactly. He was doing something that senior officers almost never do. He was narrating a recognition out loud, which is harder than it looks because it requires you to let the other person watch you see something you should have seen earlier. Yes, sir, I said quietly, not to rub it in, just to confirm I'd heard it. He looked at the paper again, signed something, closed the folder. The F-12 program is going to need an operational flight lead, he said. Someone who could take it through the remaining certification cycle and document what actual operational use looks like. It'll mean being attached to the program officially. It'll mean the classified notation in your permanent record gets cleaned up. He set his pen down. It means the file looks the way it should have looked for the past 2 years. I stood straight. I understand, sir. Do you want the assignment? I thought about the F-12. Cold to the touch in the dark hangar. Patient. The bass note shudder of its ignition. The way it had felt when the oscillation damped, and we found each other in the middle of 80 feet and Mach 1.2 and an 11-second window. Yes, sir, I said. Do. He nodded. And that was all. No ceremony. No speech. He picked up another folder, which meant I was dismissed, and I walked to the door, and I opened it, and the Gulf morning came in, heat and salt and the distant sound of an aircraft somewhere, always an aircraft somewhere on a base like this. aJoke was waiting in the corridor. He had no reason to be there. His job was the hangar, the aircraft, the maintenance bay. He'd already done his part. But he was there, arms crossed, back against the wall, in the exact pose of a man who has been waiting and decided that waiting was the correct use of his time. I stopped when I saw him. Well, he said. F-12 program, I said. Flight lead. He was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then he uncrossed his arms and put his hands in his pockets, which for aJoke was approximately equivalent to throwing a party. Good, he said. She needs someone who knows how to listen to her. We walked out into the morning together. Reflection, I've thought about that briefing 100 times since. Not obsessively, not with anger, which would have been easier. More the way you think about a thing that showed you something real about the architecture of the world, the way certain rooms are built, the way certain seats are placed at the edge of the light. Rourke's joke wasn't unique. I like to say I'd like it to be a story about one man's exceptional thoughtlessness, but it wasn't. It was ordinary. The most ordinary moment in the story, actually, far more ordinary than the corridor transit, than the oscillation at 80 feet, than the moment the Corinthia's comms officer said thank you in a voice that had been sitting in the dark. The joke was the ambient noise of a room that hadn't been listening. And the thing I know now that I maybe half knew then, you can be angry about ambient noise, or you can use it. The moment Rourke said F-12 dismissively, like a punchline, he handed me the opening, because once the name was in the room, I could say yes. And yes, said clearly into a room that expected no, doesn't sound like defiance. It sounds like capability, which is ultimately the only argument that actually works. The Corinthia made it back to port 16 hours later. 53 crew, all present. The comms officer, her name was Lieutenant Sarah Park, sent a message through official channels that ended up routed to Base Commander Mercer's office. It was 2 sentences. It said that she didn't know who Spectre was, but she wanted them to know that when the burst transmission came through the dark, it had sounded like the world remembering they were there. Mercer forwarded it to Halston. Halston forwarded it to me. He added no note. He didn't need to. The F-12 is certified now. She flies clean at altitude, and she still talks back below 300 feet, and I have learned to hear the difference between a shudder that's just her opinion and a shudder that means business, and that distinction, improbable as it sounds, was worth every hour of work and every document I had to file and every meeting in a room where the light doesn't quite reach. Some things, once they find the right hands, stop being broken. They just needed someone to listen.